The High Alpha of the Ironveil pack did not kneel for gods. He had never knelt for anything. For 23 years, Draven Ashford had ruled the Northern Territories with a fist carved from iron and a gaze sharp enough to split bone. 12 pacts had submitted to his banner. 3 border wars had ended not with treaties, but with silence, because the losing side had nothing left to say. When he walked into a room, men who had survived battlefields found reasons to look at the floor. So when the ancient blood pact activated at the stroke of midnight, and every vein in his body lit up like a brand pressed to raw flesh, the first thing Draven did was refuse to believe it. The second thing he did was crash to one knee in the middle of his own war chamber, in front of 6 of his generals, and press his palm flat against the cold stone floor because something in the marrow of his bones had just been rewritten, and that something was pointing, with infuriating precision, toward the servant quarters at the eastern end of the castle. One of his generals, a weathered old wolf who had survived more battles than most men had lived days, opened his mouth. "My lord, are you?" "Speak," Draven said, very quietly, "and I will have your tongue removed before morning." The general closed his mouth. Draven straightened. His jaw was tight enough to crack stone. His silver eyes were doing something they had never done before in 2 decades of calculated cruelty. They were uncertain, because somewhere in the eastern wing, a girl who scrubbed floors for coin was now, by the binding law of the oldest magic in the known world, his mistress, his commander, the one living soul on this earth whose direct orders his body was physically, magically, and very humiliatingly compelled to obey. And she had absolutely no idea. Chapter 1. Her name was Neva. Neva Corin, 19 years old, daughter of a debt-drowned merchant who had sold her indenture to Ironveil Castle at age 14. For 5 years she had scrubbed floors, hauled water, endured the particular brand of cruelty that castle stewards reserved for the lowest rung of the help, and developed, through sheer necessity, a very efficient method of becoming invisible. She was good at invisible. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant the housemaster's hand didn't find your ear. Invisible meant another day above ground. On the morning that changed everything, Neva was on her knees, not in any poetic sense, but literally on hands and knees, scrubbing the grout between the great hall's flagstones with a brush that had seen better decades. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. There was soap in her hair. She was singing something under her breath, quietly to herself, because the hall was empty this early, and the acoustics were honestly quite good, and if the stones were going to be this miserable to clean, she was at least going to have a decent accompaniment. She did not hear the footsteps. She should have. A wolf's footsteps carry weight in a way that human steps do not, a kind of ground consciousness, a pressure that arrives before the sound does. But she was mid-verse, her brush was scraping against particularly stubborn lime, and her entire focus was on the 3-inch patch of floor directly in front of her face. So when the shadow fell across her, she startled, looked up, and found herself staring at a pair of boots. Very fine boots. Black leather, iron-buckled, worth more than her annual wage. Her eyes traveled past legs that were built like they had been designed specifically to intimidate, traveled past a torso that wore a charcoal doublet-like armor, traveled, with increasing dread, all the way up to a face that she recognized immediately, because the entire castle had his portrait hanging in the entrance hall, and also because that face had once made a visiting duke cry. The High Alpha looked down at her. She looked up at him. There was a very long pause. "You're blocking the walkway," he said. Neva looked at the floor. She looked at herself. She looked at the roughly 4 feet of empty flagstone on either side of her. "My lord," she said carefully, "the walkway is quite wide." His expression did not change. It never did, apparently. "Move." She moved. She pressed herself to the side, brush still in hand, soap dripping onto the floor she had just cleaned, and watched the high alpha of the known world's most feared pack stride through his own great hall at 6 in the morning with the specific energy of a man who had not slept and was furious about it. She thought nothing of it. She went back to her grout. She did not know that he had stopped 3 steps past her and stood very still for a moment. She did not know that something in the pact had tugged at him the way a hook tugs a fish, insistent and directional, and that the pull was coming from her.
She did not know any of this.
She was thinking about the lime deposit. The castle's head steward was a man named Bodrick, and Bodrick had 3 rules. The first was that the servants were invisible. The second was that the servants were efficient. The third was that if any servant disrupted the operations of Ironveil's nobility, Bodrick would personally ensure they regretted it in ways that were creative and long-lasting. Neva had broken none of these rules in 5 years, which was why she was entirely unprepared when Bodrick appeared at the servants' lunch table with an expression that suggested she had broken all 3 simultaneously. "You," he said, pointing at her with the particular authority of a man who had never in his life pointed at anything with uncertainty. "You are to report to the High Alpha's study at the second bell of the afternoon." The table went quiet. Neva set down her bread. "I beg your pardon? I did not ask you to beg anything. Report at the second bell. Do not be late. Do not be disheveled. Do not," he paused, apparently reaching into some private reserve of specificity, "speak unless directly spoken to." He left. Neva stared at the door for a moment. Across the table, the laundress who had worked the castle for 30 years gave her a look that said everything condolences could say without using words. "What did you do?" the laundress asked. "I told him the walkway was wide," Neva said. The laundress winced. The study was not what she had expected. She had expected something cold and severe, all sharp angles and deliberate intimidation. Instead, it was a room full of maps. Floor to ceiling on 2 walls, hand-drawn and annotated in cramped writing, territorial lines redrawn and redrawn again in different colored inks. Books everywhere, not decoratively either, but with broken spines and dog-eared pages, and the general look of things that had actually been read. A fire going even in the mild weather, because wolves ran warm. And in the chair behind the desk, the High Alpha, with his fingers laced together and his silver eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. She stood in the doorway. He said nothing. She said nothing. The fire crackled. "Close the door," he said finally.
She did.
"Sit." She found the chair across the desk and sat in it with the careful posture of someone who was very aware that she was in a room she was not supposed to be in a chair she was not supposed to occupy, having a meeting she had no context for. He studied her. Not rudely, exactly, but with the concentrated focus of someone cataloging a problem. "How long have you worked in this castle?" he asked. 5 years, my lord." "Your name?" "Neva, my lord. Neva Corin." Something shifted in his expression. So subtle she almost missed it. "Almost." "Corin," he repeated. "Yes, my lord." "Your father's name?" She held very still. "Aldous Corin, my lord." A pause. His jaw tightened in a way that was not anger, exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Your father," he said, "was a very stupid man." Neva opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "He was," she agreed, because he had been genuinely, and there was no diplomatic way to argue it. Something changed in the room then. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to. But the High Alpha looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost, beneath all that carefully maintained severity, surprised. "Leave," he said. She stood. She crossed to the door. "Corin."
She stopped.
"Return tomorrow. Same time." She turned to look at him, caught herself before she asked why, because she was invisible and efficient and Bodrick's 3rd rule was a real threat. She simply nodded. She left. She spent the rest of the afternoon turning the conversation over in her mind like a coin, looking for meaning on both sides and finding nothing she could pin down. What she did not know was that behind her, the moment the door closed, Draven Aldrich Ashford, High Alpha of the Ironveil territories, most feared wolf lord of the northern continent, pressed his knuckles to his forehead and spent 30 seconds in the very private hell of someone who had just realized that the girl he was legally, magically, inescapably bound to serve was 19 years old, smelled faintly of floor soap, and had, with complete composure, called his hallway wide. He had no idea what to do with her. This, for a man who had never not known what to do with anything, was uniquely terrible. Before we continue, I'd like you to let me know in the comment section where you're currently watching this story from. I'll love to give you a special shout, and also find out how far our mini wolf pack goes. Please do not forget to like and hit the subscribe button for more interesting werewolf romance stories. Chapter 2. 3 days passed before the pact asserted itself in a way that could no longer be ignored. It happened in the kitchens. Neva was there for her nightly duties, which included the unremarkable task of carrying hot water from the great copper boiler to the upper hallway wash stations. It was a 2-bucket job, awkward rather than difficult, requiring more patience than strength, which was why the castle had assigned it to her specifically. She had the patience of someone who had learned very early that hurrying only meant spilling. She did not hear the confrontation until she was in the doorway. 2 of the castle's senior wolves, guards by rank and temperament, were standing over one of the kitchen boys. The boy, perhaps 12, perhaps younger, was pressed against the wall with the specific rigid stillness of a child who had learned that movement attracted attention. One of the guards had his hand on the boy's collar. The other was saying something in a low voice that Neva could not make out but did not need to, because the tone was universal. She should have turned around. Every sensible instinct she had developed over 5 years of institutional invisibility told her to turn around. She put her buckets down. "Leave him alone," she said. The guards turned. She was, in terms of threat assessment, roughly as intimidating as a moderately sized rabbit. She was aware of this. She said it anyway, because the kitchen boy had gone a color that worried her. The guard holding the boy's collar looked at her with the specific expression of someone who found her existence mildly interesting and not remotely concerning. "Go about your business, girl." "He hasn't done anything," she said. "Neva," the kitchen boy whispered, which was either gratitude or a warning, and probably both. "I said." The door to the kitchen opened. All 3 of them, Neva, the guards, the kitchen boy, turned. Draven stood in the doorway. He was not supposed to be in the kitchens. He was the High Alpha. There were entire architectural structures in place to ensure he never needed to enter the kitchens. But he was there, and he had arrived with the specific unhurried energy of someone who had not been summoned and was not surprised to be where he was, which meant he had been heading here before whatever instinct had directed him could articulate why. The guards released the kitchen boy immediately. The boy slid sideways along the wall with the agility of the frequently escaped. Draven looked at Neva. She looked back. His expression was doing that unreadable thing again. "My lord," one of the guards started. "Out," Draven said. They left.
Quickly.
With the particular urgency of men who had made a calculation about whether to ask questions and decided firmly against it. The kitchen boy evaporated through a side door, which left Neva standing next to her 2 buckets of now slightly cooled water, and the High Alpha standing in a kitchen doorway, looking at her with silver eyes that had not blinked. "You are going to say something to 2 of my senior guard," he said. "I was in the middle of saying it," she clarified. "I'm aware." He paused. It was profoundly unwise. "Probably. They outweigh you by a considerable margin." "I noticed that, yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "Pick up your buckets," he said finally.
She did.
She walked past him to the door. Corin.
She stopped.
She was beginning to feel that her name in his voice functioned as punctuation. Be at my study again tomorrow. You said the same thing 3 days ago, she pointed out, and when I arrived you stared at me for 20 minutes and then told me to leave. The pause this time was almost different. Almost. Yes, he said. Be there anyway. She left. He stood in the empty kitchen and stared at the door she had walked through and thought, not for the first time, about the blood pact and his father and the very specific sequence of spectacularly bad decisions that had led to the situation in which he currently found himself. The pact's history was not something Draven had ever expected to be relevant. It was old magic, older than the Ironveil name, older than the pact structure, older than the territorial lines he had spent his adult life drawing and defending. His father had told him about it once, briefly, in the dismissive tone of someone handling a theoretical. The pact had been written by the first High Alpha's Maid, a woman of significant magical ability and apparently significant grievance, who had embedded within the bloodline a corrective clause. If the ruling Alpha ever became, in the judgment of the pact itself, categorically unjust in his dominion, the pact would bind him to the person his own power had most wronged. Not to punish him. That had been the first Alpha's wife's particular genius. Not to strip his power or diminish his authority before the pact. To educate him. The pact bound the Alpha in service to the wronged party until the debt was paid in full. And the pact, being old magic and therefore not interested in technicalities, defined paid in full entirely on its own terms. Draven had, 14 months ago, in the course of a border negotiation, accepted a debt payment from a merchant named Aldous Corin in the form of a 5-year indenture of Corin's eldest daughter. He had done it because the debt was real, the payment was legal, and he had not thought about it for more than 30 seconds. He had not known then what the pact would think of it. He knew now. The pact thought that reducing a 19-year-old girl to unpaid labor in exchange for a debt her father had created without her knowledge or consent was, specifically and precisely, unjust. The pact had opinions. Draven found this deeply inconvenient. He brought in his oldest advisor that night, a woman named Counselor Ispa, who was 70 years old, had served 3 generations of Ashford Alphas, and was the only person alive who spoke to Draven with the casual directness of someone who had watched him take his first steps and was not impressed. She listened to the entire account with the stillness of a person doing mental arithmetic on a very large number. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, that is not helpful," Draven said. "I'm gathering myself." She folded her hands. The pact is genuine. I've read the binding texts. The corrective clause has not been invoked in 4 generations. I know it's genuine. I felt it activate. And you've confirmed the girl is the specific party named? I didn't need to confirm it. The pull is directional. It points to her. Every time I'm within 50 feet, the pact pulls toward her with the subtlety of a yoke around my neck. He said this with the contained energy of a man who had swallowed something very hot and was pretending it wasn't affecting him. I need to know how to break it. Ispa was quiet. Ispa. I heard you. She unfolded her hands, refolded them differently. Draven, the clause cannot be broken from your end. That is specifically by design. He was very still. It can only be dissolved, she continued, when the wronged party releases it, of their own accord, without coercion. She doesn't know it exists.
No.
She doesn't know any of this exists. Also no. He stood up and walked to the window because sitting still while the walls closed in was not something he was designed for. So, I am too, he said, and the weight in his voice was monumental. Wait. You are too, in the language of the binding text, make right what was made wrong. She scrubs floors. Yes. Because of me.
Well,
Because of your decision, which is arguably the same thing. He stared out the window at the dark territory beyond the castle walls. A territory he had built. A dominion he had fought for. A legacy he had bled to maintain. He thought about Neva, who had told him his hallway was wide and then gone back to her grout. She cannot know, he said finally. Isfa raised an eyebrow. The girl cannot know about the pact. If she learns that I am bound to her, she will assume coercion in anything I do to remedy the situation. The release must be genuine. He turned from the window. His voice had shifted into the particular register he used for military strategy, and Isfa recognized it with a quiet, private worry, because it meant he had decided something. She must never know what I am. Chapter 3. The first time the pact compelled him to act, he was in his war chamber. Routine morning report. 12 men around the table. Troop movements, territorial updates, trade route security. The kind of meeting Draven ran with the efficient precision of someone who had been doing it since he was 18 and had no patience for theatrics. He was 3 items into the agenda when the sensation arrived. Not pain exactly. More like pressure, building behind his sternum with the directional intensity of a compass needle finding north. He recognized it from before. He recognized what it meant. He stopped mid-sentence. The generals waited. He turned his head slightly, as if listening, and the 6 men in that room who had survived decades of service under this particular alpha experienced something they would describe to their families later as genuinely alarming, because the high alpha's expression, for the space of 2 heartbeats, was not controlled at all. He stood up. "Continue without me," he said. He walked out. He found her in the eastern corridor, on a ladder, attempting to replace the glass in a high window that the autumn storms had cracked. The ladder was not steady. Someone had propped it against the wall at an angle that worked mathematically only if you assumed the ladder was not going to be moved by the wind coming through the broken window, which was currently moving through the broken window at a pace that was definitely affecting the ladder. He stopped at the base of it. "Get down," he said. She turned on the ladder and looked down at him with a specific expression of someone who was holding a pane of glass, balanced on an unstable ladder, and had just been interrupted mid-task by the most powerful wolf in the north. "I'm almost done," she said. "The ladder is at the wrong angle." "I've accounted for that." "You've accounted," he said, with contained precision, "for a 9-degree incline carrying your weight plus a pane of glass in wind conditions that are currently an 8 on the castle scale." She blinked. "You know the castle's wind scale? Get down." "I will be done in." The wind moved. The ladder shifted. Her hand came off the wall, and the glass tilted, and she made a small involuntary sound that he was already moving for. He caught the ladder with one hand and her with the other, which involved the ladder not moving and her landing against his shoulder rather than the flagstones, which was better than the alternative and significantly more proximate than either of them had been expecting. He set her down. She stepped back immediately. There was color on her face that had not been there before. "Thank you," she said carefully. He looked at the ladder for a moment. Then he repositioned himself at the correct angle, braced it with his boot, and looked at her. She looked at him. "Go on then," he said. She climbed the ladder, replaced the glass in about 45 seconds flat because she was, in fact, very competent, and came back down. He was still there. "You could have sent a steward," she said. "I was passing." "You are never passing, my lord. Your chambers are on the opposite side of the castle." He had nothing to say to this, because it was entirely true. He had not been passing. He had been 3 corridors away at a meeting of significant strategic importance, and the pact had pulled him here like a chain. He said nothing. She picked up her supply bucket. "Thank you," she said again, and her voice was quieter this time. Not smaller, just different. He turned and walked back the way he had come, with the specific energy of a man engaged in a strategic retreat and calling it something else. The servants noticed. This was inevitable. Castles were ecosystems, and ecosystems have observers. People whose entire occupational skill set involved watching and inferring and passing inference along over meals. Within a week of his appearances in the Eastern Wing, the kitchen, the Eastern Corridor, and twice in the laundry yard, Ironveil's servant population had reached a consensus that was roughly 40% accurate. "He's watching her for something," said one of the understewards at the servants' dinner table, with the confidence of a man who watched people for a living. "Watching her because of something more like," said the laundress, whose 30 years of service had given her a particularly calibrated view of the castle's power structures. Neva, who was present for this conversation, looked up from her bread. "I'm right here." "Yes," said the laundress. "We know." He calls her to his study. Someone else offered from further down the table, helpfully. "Does nothing," added someone else. "Stares at her from what I've heard. Then tells her to leave." Neva looked around at the assembled faces. "This is deeply uncomfortable," she said. "Imagine how it is for the rest of us," said the laundress cheerfully. "We've never seen him take an interest in anything smaller than a military campaign. You're confusing a lot of people." "Including me," Neva said. "That might be the point," the laundress said, and went back to her soup with the expression of someone who had solved a puzzle and was satisfied to keep the solution to herself. The second time the pact compelled him in front of witnesses was worse. Draven had a temper. This was not news. He managed it with the practiced containment of someone who had learned very early that an unmanaged temper in a dominant wolf was not just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. It sent tremors through the pack hierarchy, made subordinates uncertain, created the kind of atmospheric instability that invited challenges.
So he managed it.
He had been managing it for 23 years. He was very good at it. He was less good at it. He was discovering when the pact was involved. The incident was simple. Bodrick, the head steward, had assigned Neva to carry supply loads from the lower courtyard to the upper stores, a job that, in winter conditions, with the stone stairs iced over, was genuinely hazardous. This was not malicious on Bodrick's part. It was simply Bodrick being Bodrick, which meant doing the math of efficiency without including human factors in the equation. Draven was crossing the upper courtyard when he saw her, carrying a crate that was too large, on stairs that were too slick, alone. The pact, he would reflect later, was perhaps less subtle than he would have preferred. He crossed the courtyard in 12 steps. He took the crate from her. She made a startled sound and looked at him with eyes that had gone very wide. "My lord, you cannot." "I am carrying it," he said. "You are the High Alpha. I am aware of the entire Northern Territories. Also aware." She stared at him. He carried the crate to the upper stores, set it down, and walked back. She was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring, with the specific expression of someone whose entire organizational model of reality was undergoing revision. Unfortunately, 2 of his senior lieutenants were at the far end of the courtyard. He was aware of them. He did not look at them. He walked back past Neva with the precise energy of a man who had done exactly what he intended to do and did not require commentary on it. That evening, the same 2 lieutenants requested an audience, which he declined. He declined the next day as well. On the 3rd day, he let them in, and Counselor Isva, who had an uncanny sense for rooms that needed her, was already there. The lieutenants stood before him with the expressions of men who had rehearsed what they wanted to say and were now finding it harder to say in person. The older one managed it. "My lord, the pack is noticing certain behaviors." Draven looked at him. "Concerning the servant girl," the second added. Draven looked at him too. "The concern," said the first lieutenant, choosing his words with the care of a man walking on ice, "is for your focus, given the border situation with the Eastern packs." "The Eastern border situation," Draven said, is managed, has been managed, will continue to be managed. Did the management of it stop in the last week? No, my lord. Did the supply lines change? The patrol rotations? The treaty negotiations? No, my lord. Then the concern, he said, and his voice was very level, very quiet, and very final, is not about the border situation. A pause. My lord. I do not require the pact to understand everything I do, he said. I do require the pact to trust that I have a reason. Do you trust that? The lieutenants exchanged a look that contained a significant private conversation. Yes, my lord, they said together.
Good. Leave.
They left. Isva, after a moment, said, That was handled. Don't, Draven said. I wasn't going to say anything complimentary. Isva. I was going to say, she continued, in the tone of someone who is absolutely going to finish her sentence, that at some point, the rest of the story needs to be considered. He looked at her. The pact binds you to service, she said. But it doesn't specify how long it takes. And it doesn't say anything about what happens in the meantime. He said nothing. She's intelligent, Isva said mildly. You've noticed that. She told me my hallway was wide. Precisely. She has terrible instincts for self-preservation. Also true. She stood up for a kitchen boy twice her size in front of castle guards because it was the right thing to do. She did that without thinking. Most good things are done without thinking, Isva said. Thinking mostly produces hesitation and justification. She folded her hands. I'm simply saying, Draven, that the pact named her for a reason. And perhaps the reason is more than a ledger to be settled. He stared at the fire for a long time after she left. Chapter 4. He began quietly, systematically to fix things. The indenture contract, which he had signed without reading in any real detail, he read in full now. It was 5 years from the date of signing. 14 months in. Over 3 years remaining. He could not release her early, without explanation, and explanation was impossible. The pact's directive was clear. The release had to be genuine. Forcing it through administrative action was not genuine, it was just a different shape of coercion. But he could make the conditions livable. He reassigned her duties. Subtly, gradually through Bodrick, framed as a general castle efficiency review, because he had learned very quickly that Bodrick was capable of creative reprisals when his authority was perceived to be challenged, and he could not protect Neva from reprisals she didn't know were happening without revealing more than she could know. Better quarters. He discovered, through what was definitely not obsessive attention, that she was sharing a room with 5 others in the North Dormitory. He arranged a reassignment to a single room on the eastern side. He told Bodrick it was a general redistribution. She received it with visible suspicion. The room assignment changed, she told Bodrick. It did, Bodrick confirmed. Why? Castle needs, Bodrick said, with the specific tone of a man delivering information he himself found improbable. Castle needs, she repeated. Yes. She looked at the room. It was small but warm, with a window and an actual desk, and it was hers alone, which she had not had in 5 years. She moved in that evening and sat on the edge of the bed for a while, looking at the room with an expression that Draven would not have seen because he was not watching. He was not watching. He was informed by a secondary report that she had looked unsettled and that she had spent an hour rearranging nothing in particular, and that she had eventually put a small book on the desk and sat down to read it. He did not find this detail in any way significant. He told himself that twice. The conversations in his study changed. They had been strange from the beginning. Him watching her sitting with careful posture, the air between them doing something that neither of them had a name for. But as the weeks passed, they became something else. She stopped asking why she was there. She stopped bracing herself for some announcement of censure or correction. She started, cautiously, answering his questions with things that were actually true. He asked about her father. Not cruelly. He had learned how to ask things without cruelty when the situation called for it. She told him, matter-of-factly, without self-pity, which was the version of grief that impressed him more than the dramatic kind. Her father had been a good man until the money started going wrong, and then he had been a scared man, and scared men did things that good men wouldn't, and she had spent some time being angry about that before she had realized that anger was a comfort she couldn't afford. He sold your indenture, Draven said.
He did.
To pay a debt he owed me. To pay a debt he owed you. She looked at him steadily. Is that why I'm here? In your study. He met her eyes, held them for a moment.
Partially, he said.
What's the other part? He looked at her for a long time with an expression she could not read. You're not what I expected, he said finally. She tilted her head. You didn't expect anything. You hadn't thought about me at all before the pact. She stopped. She stopped. The word hung in the air between them. He went very still. The color had left her face. She started, and then stopped again, because she had just said a word she had never used, a word she did not know, a word that had arrived in her mouth the way truth sometimes did, from somewhere below intention. What, she said slowly, is a pact? He was very quiet. Draven. She had never used his name. She didn't know she was using it now. It fell out of her with the same below-intention quality as the word before it. He set his hands flat on the desk. A controlled gesture, which she had learned meant he was using the desk to hold something still. How much, he said, very carefully. Do you know about blood magic? Chapter 5.
She did not take it well.
This was understandable. He told her the relevant portions carefully, with the particular precision of someone who had prepared the explanation and was monitoring, word by word, for the exact moment she stopped listening in order to start reacting. The moment came approximately at the phrase compelled to serve. She said, and then stopped. Yes. You're bound. Yes. To me? Yes. She stood up. Sit down, he said, and then immediately felt the specific humiliation of the pact tugging at the instruction, because he had used the imperative voice with her, and the pact did not particularly enjoy that. She did not sit down, partly because she was in the middle of a significant personal revelation, and partly because something in the quality of his voice had just done something unusual.
The room, she said.
What? My room. The single room. That was you. He said nothing. The window. On the ladder. Nothing. The corridor. With the kitchen boy. She looked at him with eyes that were doing something complicated. How long have you been? Since the night of the pact. 14 months ago. She sat down. Not because he had told her to, because her legs had made the decision independently. She started. She stopped. She looked at her hands. You didn't tell me, she said.
No.
You've been. The pact compels you, and you've just been. She looked up. Why didn't you tell me? You could have told me. I could have released it. You could have been free of this months ago. The release must be genuine, he said. If you knew I was bound to you, every action I took in your direction would carry the shadow of it. You would release the pact because you felt sorry for me or obligated or afraid. Not because the debt was truly settled. She stared at him. That is, she said slowly, either very principled or very manipulative. I am aware it resembles both. Which is it? He met her eyes. Principled. Though I would understand if you didn't believe that. A long silence. The fire crackled. You carried a supply crate, she said. Yes. In front of your lieutenants. Yes. And that was the pact. That particular instance, yes.
She thought about this.
And the walkway. The first morning. I was 3 corridors away, he said. I came because the pact directed me. I told you to move because I needed to leave before I said something I hadn't yet decided to say. She was quiet for a while. What would you have said? She asked. He looked at her with the expression she had never been able to read. She was beginning to wonder if unreadable had been her interpretation and restrained was closer to the truth. That I had made a decision about you without knowing you, he said, and that I was beginning to understand why that mattered. She took a breath. Let it out. I need to think, she said. I know. I need to think for more than 10 minutes. Yes. And I need you too. She stopped. Looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Something that was not quite the careful composure she wore like armor. I need you to give me a day. Of course. She stood. She walked to the door. She stopped. The pact, she said, without turning.
Right now.
Is it pulling you anywhere? He looked at her back. No, he said. She nodded once and left. He sat in the quiet study for a long time after, staring at the door, and thought about the fact that the pact had not pulled him anywhere for the past 3 weeks. He had been coming to his own study. For her. Without the pact. Chapter 6. She came back the next day. Not at the appointed time. Earlier, not by much, but earlier, which meant she had been moving toward the study before she had told herself she was going to. He noticed. He said nothing about it. She sat in the chair across the desk. She folded her hands in a way that suggested she had prepared something to say. She said it. I've been thinking about the release. I assumed I could release it right now. It would be easy. You could be free of it. Yes. But, she said, and the word carried weight. I want to know what you did. The whole of it. Not what the pact decided. What you actually did. He was quiet for a moment. I accepted your father's indenture of you as a debt payment. I did not know you. I did not consider what it meant for you. I treated you as an asset in an accounting ledger. And before that, he frowned. Before, you said the pact activates when the ruling Alpha becomes categorically unjust in his dominion. She looked at him steadily. I'm one person. One indenture. I'm not the first person something like this has happened to in Ironveil, am I? The silence was very telling. She waited. No, he said finally. So, the pact didn't activate for me specifically. You were the tipping point, he said. The most direct wrong. But it had been building. She sat with this for a moment. I've been thinking about what Counselor Isva told me, she said. He went still. You spoke with Isva? She came to me this morning. Neva met his eyes. She said you'd tell her not to. She said she was going to anyway. He made a mental note to have a very particular conversation with Isva. She told me the pact doesn't specify how it's satisfied, Neva continued. That it's up to the wrong party to determine when the debt is genuinely settled. That's correct. So the question isn't whether to release it. She tilted her head. The question is what settling it actually means. He watched her. For me, she said, it means you change things. Not for me specifically, I mean that too, yes, but not only. You change the practice. The indenture system. The way your pact treats the people at the bottom of it. Her voice was level. Not angry. Decided. Those are the terms. That's what genuine looks like to me. A pause. You're giving me a task, he said. I'm giving you a standard. Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. You seem like the kind of man who does better with standards. He looked at her for a long moment. That is, he said, either very principled or very manipulative. She met his eyes, and there was something bright in hers. I would understand, she said, if you didn't know which. Chapter 7. The pack knew something had changed. They didn't know what specifically. The High Alpha had always been opaque in his workings, a feature rather than a flaw, deliberately maintained. But there was a quality to the opacity now that was different from before. Before, he had been contained and distant in the way of someone who had chosen distance. Now he was contained and present in the way of someone who was paying very close attention. He began holding general assemblies. Not the military kind. Those had always existed. These were civil. Open hall, twice monthly, where any member of the Ironveil territories could bring a complaint or a case directly to the High Alpha's hearing. His lieutenants were baffled. His counselors were cautiously optimistic. His generals were quietly waiting for the angle because there was always an angle. The angle slowly became apparent to those paying close attention. The High Alpha was listening, actually listening, to serving staff who had been wrongly accused, to farm hands who had disputes with landlords, to women whose contracts had been rewritten without consent. He heard everything with the same focused, silver-eyed attention he gave to military briefings. And then he acted on it, which was the part that really confused people. The indenture review, framed as a general administrative efficiency project, which everyone understood was a cover story and no one questioned because the results were undeniably better, began. In the space of 8 months, 47 people had their indenture terms revised. 11 had theirs dissolved. 4 were found to be fraudulent to begin with, and those cases went to a very uncomfortable series of hearings for the merchants involved. Neva watched all of this from the eastern wing. She was still a servant. This was her choice. The pact's dissolution was in her hands, and she had made the terms clear, and she was waiting to see whether they were met. But she was not, she had realized with some private amusement, only a servant. Twice monthly, she was in his study at the second bell. They had stopped pretending this was formal. She sat across the desk. He sat behind it, and they talked about the cases, about the decisions, about the standard she had set, and the progress toward it. He asked her opinion, not because the pact required it, but because she had an angle on the underside of Ironveil's power structures that no one in his council had, and she was not afraid to say so. She had stopped being afraid of a lot of things she was noticing. "The Orvain case," she said one evening. Outside the window, the first winter snow was beginning. The woman who was re-indentured by a second master after the first sold her contract. "I reviewed it this morning. The second master argues the transfer was legal under existing code." He's correct. And the code will be revised by the end of the month. She looked at him. "You're moving fast." "I was slow to start," he said simply. "The math evens out." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you," she said carefully, "doing this because the pact requires it, or because you've decided to?" He met her eyes. "The pact," he said, "stopped pulling me toward your study approximately 5 months ago." She absorbed this. "And you kept coming," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because," he said, "you are the only person in this castle who will tell me when the walkway is wide." She looked at him. Something in her face did what it had been doing more frequently, that thing she hadn't had a name for until recently. "That's a terrible reason," she said. "It's the accurate one." She looked out the window at the snow. "I think," she said, "the debt might be close to settled." "I know," he said. "Which means the pact dissolves." "Yes." "Which means you don't have to come to the study anymore." He was quiet. "Draven," she said. He looked at her. "Is there something you want to say that isn't about the pact?" The fire crackled. Outside, the snow came down. He said it. Chapter 8. The formal dissolution of the Blood Pact was, by ancient protocol, done at midnight, in the High Alpha's war chamber, with Counselor Isva as witness. Neva stood across the stone floor from Draven, and she did not look like a girl who scrubbed grout. She looked like what she was, someone who had endured and chosen and decided, and was now standing in the room where it ended. He looked like what he was, someone who had been larger than everyone around him since he was 18, and who had, in the last 10 months, quietly become a different size. Not smaller, just differently shaped. Shaped by something other than war. The terms of the dissolution, Isva said formally, in the ritual language that the pact required. Wronged party, do you, of your own free and uncoerced will, declare the debt paid in full? Neva looked at Draven. He looked back. He had not asked her to release it. He had told her, when it came to this, that the choice was hers and he would stand by it either way, and she had believed him because she had spent 10 months watching what a person did when they had decided to be honest, and it looked exactly like that. I do, she said. The air in the room changed. Not dramatically, no lightning, no dramatic surge of visible magic. The pact was old and understated, the way permanent things often were. Something simply released, like a long breath let out, and Draven's hands, which had been slightly closed at his sides, opened. He breathed. Pact dissolved, Isva said formally, and then, in her completely normal voice, there. Someone should have done that 4 generations ago, frankly. She picked up her candle. I'll leave you both. The castle won't start itself in the morning. She left. They stood in the quiet war chamber, maps on every wall, the fire burning low. So, Neva said. So, he said, you're free. I was free, he said, for about 5 months. And you stayed anyway. I stayed anyway. She was quiet for a moment. Draven, if I hadn't released the pact tonight. I would have waited, he said. I would have waited as long as you needed. That's very patient, for a man who once made a duke cry. I've had a good teacher, he said. In patience. She looked at him. The expression she'd never had a name for was fully visible now, unhidden, and it looked like something that had been building for a long time in a person who had been very carefully holding on to it. There are things I want to say that aren't about the pact, she said. His expression, the one she had finally, after 10 months, learned to read, said everything. I know, he said. So do I. The indenture system in the Ironveil territories was formally restructured in the spring following the pact's dissolution. It was called, in the official records, the Corrin Reform, which caused a certain amount of private amusement for the woman the reform was named after, since no one in the council had checked with her before naming it, and she had spent the first 3 years of her life in the castle being invisible. She was less invisible now. She was not a servant. She had not been a servant since the day Draven had offered the release of her indenture, and she had said, with characteristic directness, that she'd prefer a different role, and what was the council's current structure, and had anyone ever considered that the advisement process might benefit from a perspective that didn't come from the top of the hierarchy? The council had considered it. Under some pressure, but genuinely. Counselor Isva had sponsored her application with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this. What was less visible in the official records was the rest of it. The High Alpha, who had not taken a mate in 23 years and had deflected every political match his council had proposed with the systematic thoroughness of someone who was not interested and was very tired of being asked, stopped deflecting. Not publicly. Not immediately. Wolves did nothing about matters of the heart in a hurry, and dominant wolves did it slower still, because the instinct was total, and they had learned to be careful with total things. But Neva Corrin had learned to read an expression that most people never managed to read at all. She was patient. She had learned patience in difficult circumstances, which was the only kind that stuck. She was, also, not afraid of anything anymore. This was perhaps the most important change. She had been afraid for so long, in so many of the small ways that accumulate when you live at the bottom of a power structure, that she had almost mistaken it for a personality trait. It was not. She had simply been waiting for conditions in which fear was optional. Those conditions now existed. The morning she made her decision, she walked into Draven's study at the second bell, sat down across the desk, and said, "I have something to say that is not about the reform." He looked up from his maps.
"It's about you," she said.
He set his pen down. "And me," she continued. "And the fact that you have not once, in 17 months, said anything directly about it, which I initially found frustrating and now find." She paused, choosing with care. "Honestly, a little endearing, because you are the most direct man I have ever met in every context except this one." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm direct in this context," he said. "You carried a crate for me. I carried a crate. You repositioned a ladder. It was at the wrong angle. You stood in a kitchen because I was in a kitchen. The pact."
"Not always," she said.
He closed his mouth. Outside the window, early spring was rewriting the territorial landscape he had spent his life defending. The snow was gone. The border disputes were managed. The eastern pacts had settled, and the northern routes were open, and the assembly halls were full on civil days. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was 19 years old when she arrived. She was 21 now. She had gone from invisible to indispensable, from soap in her hair to ink on her hands, from carrying water to carrying weight in the rooms that decided things. He had watched every day of it.
Not because he was bound to.
"Neva," he said. "Draven," she said. "I have never," he said carefully, "wanted anything the way I want." "I know," she said. "I wasn't finished. You were going to say something very large and absolute and probably a little terrifying." "Yes." "Then say it."
He did.
She listened. When he was done, the room was very quiet, and outside the window the territories were turning green, and Neva Corrin, who had arrived in Ironveil Castle at 14 years old to scrub floors and become invisible, sat across the desk from the most powerful wolf in the known world and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "Stop looking at me like that," she added. "Like what?" "Like you won a war." "I didn't win a war," he said, and for the first time in 23 years, Draven Ashford smiled. "I was outmaneuvered by someone half my weight who told me my hallway was wide." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. He thought it was the best sound in the Northern Territories. He did not say this. She could tell anyway. The pact bound him to serve her. But no pact made him love her. He managed that entirely on his own.